chapter. If you would like to turn and read along with me, Deuteronomy chapter 30. We'll be reading verses 15 to 20. Deuteronomy chapter 30, beginning in verse 15. And the word says, "See, I have set before you today life and prosperity, death and adversity. And that I command you today to love the Lord your God, to walk in His ways, to keep His commandments and His statutes and His judgments, that you may live and multiply, that the Lord your God may bless you in the land where you're entering to possess. But if your hearts turn away and you will not obey, but are drawn away and worship other gods and serve them, I declare to you today that you shall surely perish. You will not prolong your days in the land where you're crossing the Jordan to enter and possess it. I call heaven and earth to witness against you today that I have set before you life and death, the blessing and the curse. So choose life in order that you may live, you and your descendants, by loving the Lord your God, by obeying His voice, and by holding fast to Him. For this is your life and the length of your days, that you may live in the land which the Lord swore to your fathers, to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, to give them." This is the word of the Lord for us today. Well, it's two choices, plain and simple. What could be any easier, really, between a choice between these two? It's life or death. It's prosperity or destruction, blessing or curse. I mean, it's pretty cut and dry, isn't it? I'm not sure I know of anyone who would intentionally wakes up in the morning just to says to themselves, today is a beautiful day for destruction. I want to be cursed today. That's my lot in life. I want to live today for death. Do you know anybody like that? I can't. Even those who are infamous for terrorizing others, those who do wake up in the morning, who plot evil among the nations, I guarantee that they're not thinking to themselves, boy, this plan sounds so good that I want it for my own life. I wish someone would do it to me. Do you think that they do that? Even the most vile and evil of people, if we dug into their psychosis for a moment, into their twisted thinking, we would most likely find in their attempt to destroy or to hurt others, that we would find that somehow they think by harming or killing other people that it'll somehow better their own life. That it'll produce for them a more prosperous life. Even though it puts a big target on their back when they do such things. Even though it will eventually cause their own death. They're, I guarantee, not thinking those 2 or 3 steps ahead. Very rarely will we find someone that says, I want to die today. That I choose death as my first and only option. The choice between what is laid out here seems pretty clear, doesn't it? Life and death, prosperity, destruction. So why then does it seem to be that there's such a gray area between the two? Why is it that we muddle along in this life as if we're hanging in the balance between life and death? As if we can't choose between which one seems to be my best option. Do I want to choose life or do I want to choose life? How do we end up with folks choosing willingly to end life without regard, or to mock God, or to curse one another? How does the choice of life not come natural and so easy as we think it should? How do we get to that place? Well, this morning I want to look at the requirements that's laid out for us for each of these choices and see if maybe we can diagnose the problem. What does it tell us that's involved in choosing life? Well, the Word says here that there's three things. We are commanded to love the Lord your God, to walk in obedience to Him, and to keep His commandments and His decrees and His laws. Three things we're given. And on the surface, you think, well, those, I can do that. That sounds pretty simple. But as we look deeper into them, perhaps we're not as faithful in keeping these three things as we think we are. First, we find that, well, the main thing is we can't love God without first knowing what it is to be loved. And that means we cannot claim to love God without first knowing and accepting His love for us in Jesus Christ. And what Jesus did for us by shedding His blood, by claiming His sacrifice over us, that's the ultimate form of love. And if we don't know that love in our lives, we can never begin to even think we know what love is, or that we know how to love God. I know I can't say this any better than the Scriptures can, so let me just turn to 1 John chapter 4 and read it to you from there, as it explains what I'm trying to say to you. 1 John chapter 4, beginning in verse 7, says this. Let me just read it from up here. Here it is. I thought I had the wrong chapter. There it is. Beloved, let us love one another, for love is from God. And everyone who loves is born of God and knows God. The one who does not love does not know God, for God is love. By this the love of God was manifest in us, that God has sent His Son, His only begotten Son, into the world so that we might live through Him. In this is love. Not that we loved God, but that He loved us and sent His Son to be the propitiation for our sins. Beloved, if God so loved us, we ought to love one another. Did you hear that? If God so loved us, we ought to love one another. No one has seen God at any time. If we love one another, God abides in us, and His love is perfected in us. By this we know that we abide in Him, and He in us, because He's given us His Spirit. We have seen and testify that the Father has sent the Son to be the Savior of the world. Whoever confesses that Jesus is the Son of God, God abides in Him, and He in God. We have come to know and have believed the love of God which God has for us. God is love, and the one who abides in love abides in God, and God abides in him. By this, love is perfected within us, so that we may have confidence in the day of judgment. Because He is, so also are we in this world. There is no fear in love, but perfect love casts out fear, because fear involves punishment, and the one who fears is not perfected in love. We love because He first loved us. But you see in this description of how we are loved and what the love of God is to look like, that perhaps we come up a bit short in how we love Him. The very first thing of what life requires, choosing life is to love God, and, well, maybe we're not loving God like we ought to. Oh, we say we love God with all our hearts, but if we truly do, then we'll love all that God has made also. We'll love like He loves, like He has loved us. Now, does that mean that we'll go and agree with everything that is done, that everything that everyone does? No, of course not. For that to be getting into what we'll get into a few moments later, and being led astray and turning our hearts away from Him. But even in disagreement with others, in disagreement with sin, we can still love. And we can love like we've been loved. So choosing life, first and foremost, means loving God, the author of love. But it also, we're told, involves walking in His ways. Well, what are the ways of God? I think a pretty good start in describing the ways of God, and we just read about Him giving us His Spirit. We talk about in Galatians 5:22 the fruit of the Spirit. God characteristics that are given to us when He gives His Spirit to us. When the power of the Holy Spirit washes over us as we accept the salvation of Christ in our lives, when we call upon His name for salvation. So the ways of God include not only His love and knowing what it means to love like He has loved us, but it also means His joy and His peace and His patience and kindness and goodness and gentleness and faithfulness and self-control. What better way to practice life and to choose life than to practice living in the joy of the Lord? To live in the peace that passes all understanding, the peace of Christ. What better way to choose life than to practice kindness and His goodness to others? To remind ourselves that even when this world is unfaithful, that even when friends fail us and money fails us and time fails us and health fails us, that God never fails. That He is faithful at all times. That He remains faithful. That the author and perfecter of our faith gives us faith. That He strengthens our faith. That He sustains our faith even when we have no strength to carry on. What better way to walk in His ways than to live in the peace that knowing that He gives us the ability to resist those temptations that come along every day in a corrupt and evil world. That we have the self-control of God within us. That we can live in that. Those are the ways of God. Just to name a few. And then choosing life also involves keeping His commands, His statutes, His laws, His decrees, however many ways you want to call these laws of God. You know, we make a big deal today about not being under the law. We're freed from the law. That was then. This is now. And we mostly do that because we don't want to read the Old Testament. And we like to wear our nice, comfortable cotton blends. That's forbidden in the law. Just kidding, of course. We do that because Jesus Christ is the fulfillment of the law. And those who make a big fuss over some of the stranger things that we find in the law really don't understand that what God required of the Israelites, those people don't understand God's grace. They don't understand God's redemption. They don't understand God's providence or His care and His love of His people. When we begin to read the law of God, most of what God all of what God required of His people, His law just makes sense. God gave His law for the good of the people. We say over and over again and remind ourselves over and over again that Jesus said the whole law could be summed up pretty much in two things, right? To love the Lord your God with all your heart and mind and soul and strength, and to love your neighbor as yourself. You just look at the Ten Commandments by themselves, and we know that summation certainly works for those 10 commandments. Keeping His commands, living as He intended for us to live, means life for us. Means choosing His ways. In fact, one of the very results that we're given, if we follow these three precepts in choosing life, is life. He says that we'll find life and we'll multiply, and that the Lord your God will bless you. We'll find the blessing of the Lord. This was true for the Israelites when they went to take possession of the promised land. That they continued to multiply just as God promised them through Abraham. The blessing of God was upon them. And it's true for us today. Now, some of you are thinking, I know that I'll sure take the blessing of God, but God, you can keep the multiplication. I'm done multiplying. But here's where it gets really good, folks. You see, this choice of life, it's not just for you. It's not just for one individual. This choice of life was for the family and for the nation. It was for generation after generation after generation. So if I choose life, and I choose to love God and walk in His ways and obey His command, and the result is I'm blessed with life, and I'm blessed with a family which is multiplying, and I'm blessed beyond belief by God, and I teach my children then to also choose life, and they too follow in that example that I set before them, and they multiply, and they love God, and they walk in His ways, and they keep His decrees, and they too will be blessed by God and multiply and teach their children to love God, and so on and so forth, and to choose life over and over and over again. That is how families prosper. That is how nations are built, and that is how nations prosper. By choosing life, by passing this on from generation to generation. Choosing life over and over and over again. Teaching our children to love life. Choose life. Love God. Walk in His ways, His commands. But you want to look at the downfall of the family. You want to look at the downfall of nations. Look at the point at which they stopped teaching their children to choose life. It's not going to be framed in that context, mind you. It's not going to be that obvious. But it begins as verse 17 says here, when hearts begin to turn away. When that one person just decides that, I just can't really fully trust God. I know He loves me, and I know that Jesus died on the cross for me, but, this religion thing is not all that cracked up to me. So, even though God gave all of Himself to me and for me, I can't give all of myself back to Him. I can't buy into all of this. I just don't think that I can trust Him with all of my life. And so the heart begins to turn away from God. And maybe it's not in every aspect of life. Maybe it's just in one tiny little area of life. Maybe it's only in one way that I don't trust Him, in one area. And so for that first person, it's just one thing. And our children look at him, that mother or that father, and they see that, they're not so faithful in maybe just that one area, but it's not so important to them in that area. And so for the children, well, they're not completely sold out to God, and He's not vitally important to God in all areas of their life, so it must not mean that He's got to be all-consuming in my life either. So for the one area of life, for the parent, it becomes 3 or 4 or 5 areas of life for the child that they don't fully give their life and trust their life to God, that they fully love God, that they fully walk in His ways, that they fully keep His commands. And then they turn around and have their own children, and those children look at their parents, and they see hardly any faith at all in their parents, that they don't choose life in hardly anything. And so now in the span of 2 generations, we've gone from choosing life to choosing death. Because there's no example at home of what it means to choose life, to fully love God, to walk in His ways, to keep His commands, we've drifted off. Our hearts have turned away. We've begun to serve other gods and run after them. In the span of just 2 short generations, we've gone from choosing life to choosing death, from choosing prosperity to choosing destruction. Do you see how easy it goes? That drift, that slow drift can turn. And if you don't believe it can happen, just go up and look. Just look this afternoon at church attendance numbers the past 50, 75 years. Span of 2 or 3 generations. How we can go from life to death. Just open your eyes and ears. Listen to the politics of our nation. See how we can go from life to death in the span of 2 or 3 generations. Just look to see how many children have died at the hands in the span of 2 or 3 generations at state-sponsored killing called abortion. I really don't think that people set out to choose it, to freely choose death, destruction, but this slow drift from loving God, from walking in His ways, from following His commands, away from His design for our lives, away from His love. Over time, we end up drawn away. And at some point, we end up freely choosing death for ourselves. And do you see that it's a repeatable pattern? For individuals, for families, for nations. We can either choose life and prosperity or death and destruction, blessings or curses. We can pass either one along to the next generation. Right now, which do you think we're passing along in this nation? I'm sad to say, I don't see us choosing life in America. But here's the good news. Friends, there's always good news with the God we serve. Here's the good news. It's not too late to choose life. It's not too late to begin living out the properties of life in our lives and pass those qualities of life along to the next generation. We still got life in our veins, don't we? We still got blood pumping through our bodies, don't we? We still have breath in our lungs, don't we? We still have the opportunity to love God, to walk in His ways, to keep His commands then, to turn our lives around, to give everything that we have back to Him. It's not too late to return to God with all of our hearts, to love like we've been loved, to walk in His ways, to live out the joy of the Lord, to live in His peace in this world, to share His grace with those who need it most, to be kind, to be good, to be faithful. It's not too late to put away serving false gods and serving false idols and to serve the one true God alone. It's not too late to put away those other gods and to keep God first in our life. It's not too late to let our children and our children's children see what true love of God looks like, to see what walking in God's ways looks like, and to teach them to live in it as well. It's not too late to choose life. So the question is, will you choose life today? Will you choose life for yourself and for your family and for your family's family and for this nation? It's got to begin somewhere. It might as well begin right here. Will you make that choice? Now, as we close this morning, maybe you're here and you've realized you've been a part of that slow drift, of turning away, of not being sold out, of being dedicated fully to loving God, of not knowing what it means to love Him with all my heart and all my soul and all my mind and all my strength, of walking in His ways and keeping His commands. And you've given yourselves over to serving other gods, the ways of this world. Today is the day. Will you put an end to it today? As we sing our closing hymn this morning, will you make the choice today to say enough is enough? God, I choose you. I'm going to choose life. Life in you. Lord, help me to know what that looks like. Help me to love like you have loved me. Friends, if you're here today and you don't fully understand what the love of God is, I'll help you understand it. We'll get to know Him together. But choose life. There's too much death in this world. Let's choose life and turn this thing around. Would you do that as we sing our closing hymn this morning? Softly and tenderly, let us stand and